Hello, guys and gals, and welcome to another episode of Skills and Abilities. Today we're going to be looking at another one of the Sorceress abilities, which is known as Firewall. Now, Firewall is a skill that has seen some interesting changes over time. It used to be really OP, then it got nerfed, and then it was really not really that great, and then it kind of got buffed, and then it got nerfed again, and then it got ridiculously buffed to the point where everybody and their mom was using it. And then it got nerfed again, but it was still stronger than it was before. And all of this has to do with the way that Firewall actually applies its damage. And we're going to talk about this today. I think this is the main thing that we need to talk about with Firewall is how does Firewall actually apply its damage? Well, first off, let's go outside and let's actually just cast Firewall so that we can look at the beauty of it. So first off, when you cast Firewall, it spreads out to the left and to the right. And it just does a massive amount of fire on the ground. It doesn't last for a really long period of time. It basically lasts for 3.6 seconds, but it will last long enough that you can cast multiple firewalls on top of each other. Now, one of the really weird things about Firewall is that it's actually comprised of 3 components. And the best way for me to show this is just to cast 3 firewalls and just pretend that this is what we're talking about. So if I cast 1, 2, 3 firewalls, this is basically how Firewall works. So Firewall has 3 components. It has 3 damage, like burning effects. These 3 burning effects will not always hit the same target. So most of the time when you use Firewall, only one of the 3 damage components will actually strike the target. The other 2 will not hit the target. And this has to do with the size of the monster. So size 1 monsters, which are things like these guys, are considered to be the smaller types. So these are little tiny monsters. They don't really take large amounts of damage from Firewall because only 1/3 of the Firewall actually hits the target. This is because of the damage output that's listed on Firewall, which is currently 29,876, is actually based upon this 1/3 principle. So, since there are 3 pieces to the Firewall, the damage is actually divided into 3, and you have to actually do that to figure out what your damage output is versus each monster type. So right now I'm dishing 29,000. Let's just round it up to 30,000 damage just for the sake of ease of access, ease of math. And let's divide that into 3. That means that each portion of the Firewall is dishing out 10,000 damage per section. Okay? Which means that versus a size 1 monster, we are dishing out 10,000 damage per second. Versus a size 2 monster, we are dishing out 20,000 damage per second. Versus a size 3 monster, you are going to be dishing out the full damage, which is the 30,000 damage per second. And you can clearly see this if you go and actually attack a size 3 monster. Bosses are size 3 monsters, by the way, and bosses take an insanely large amount of damage from Firewall versus smaller monsters, which take much less. Urdars, Pit Lords, these monsters generally have size 3, so they generally take the largest amount of damage from something like this. They're also immune to fire, though, unfortunately, so let me see if I can find a different size 3 monster. Canyon of the Magi would be size 3. If there's the correct monsters here. Yeah, here we go. So these are size 3 monsters, and the size 3 monsters are going to get the full effect. And for sake of argument, let's take the weapon away from the mercenary so he stops making us look cool. As you can see, the crushers are taking the maximum damage output from the Firewall. It's just absolutely destroying them. And this is hell difficulty, by the way. Let's change this to Players 8, if it's not already on Players 8. So we can get an even more dramatic effect here with Firewall. We're going to refresh the zone just to make sure we've got all Players 8 monsters in the zone. And the reason why I want to do this is because I want to show you kind of the dramatic damage difference between, say, a size 3 monster, a size 2 monster, and a size 1. And that's really what it comes down to with Firewall, because Firewall just does so much different damage depending on the monster. So these are player 8 crushers, and as you can see, they get absolutely demolished. The Hellslingers are immune to fire, so I can't use those as an example. The beetles, however, are not, and beetles, I believe, are size 2, I think? Oh, God. Spear cats teleport me directly into the doojank, because I got an Oculus on. Let's go somewhere where there's not spear cats, shall we? I believe that Eldritch is a size 2 monster. Let's test on him. So Eldritch should be taking 66% of the damage, or these enslaves will take 66% of the damage. And as you can see, they definitely don't die as quickly as the Crushers did, but they definitely still die. And then size 1 monsters is going to be things like Fallen, which Fallen are always immune to fire, so we're going to have to find a different target. Lost City should work. There's usually a bunch of size 1 monsters in Lost City. Get out of here. You're not size 1s. You guys are size 2s. I need the small boys. Well, these are size 2s as well. Now, for those of you who might be interested, what was the bug that made Firewall so powerful? Well, the bug that made Firewall so powerful was actually the fact that the number of effects was actually stacking. So it was actually kind of weird because for the longest time, Firewall had always been in a state where it never really applied its full damage except for versus like a boss or something like that, which were size 3, or like Urdars and Pit Lords. But the problem is that, well, in this particular patch, Firewall was actually applying its full damage to any target that it touched. So it was applying the full 33,000 or 30,000 damage to every single monster that it hit. And it was also applying this multiple times if you cast the Firewall on the targets multiple times, which meant that you were dishing out some pretty crazy damage to pretty much anything that you touched with Firewall, even if the Firewall didn't actually hit the target, like, entirely. So, and what do I mean by hit the target entirely? Well, this has to do with the size. So let's talk about this for a second as well, since we can't seem to find any size 1 monsters. If you touch the edge of the Firewall, and this would apply to PvP, by the way, if you touch the edge of the Firewall, if you were to just barely graze the Firewall, like on the very edge of it, you get burned by 1 wall. 1 of the 3 effects. If you run through the Firewall, you're most likely going to get hit by all 3 effects. And this is kind of like comes down to exactly what the problem was with Firewall in this patch. So Firewall was actually applying the full damage even if you just barely grazed the Firewall. Even if like you just kind of like just touched the edge of the Firewall like this. It was still applying all 3 effects to you. And it was a massive hit of damage. And Firewall is actually pretty cool, though. The first thing about Firewall that makes it so amazing, by the way, is just the sheer minimalness of actually building it. It only requires 20, 40, 60 points. And the thing that I really like about Fire Mastery is that Warmth is one of those synergies. Warmth is going to help you with your mana consumption. It's great if you're going to build an energy shield sorceress. It has a lot of usefulness within the sorceress as a whole. And building Warmth isn't necessarily a negative. With a lot of other abilities, like, say, Fireball, where you have to build Firebolt, or, you know, like with Frozen Orb, where you have to build Ice Bolt, some of these abilities tend to be rather useless, and you don't actually get good effect from them, right? But Warmth is one of those abilities that, hey, you know, if I have to spend 20 points into this, well, at least I'm getting something really nice out of it. You know what I mean? Which makes Firewall extremely easy to build into hybrid builds, because you only really have to spend 20, 40 points into it, and you get the free mana regeneration from it as well for the extra 20. And that means that no matter what other build you go with, you're going to have really good mana regeneration along with what other hybrid effect you choose. Number 2 is, as you level it up, it starts to go really far, which means it kind of hits a lot of targets, and with a little bit of skill, you can actually do some pretty crazy things with it. Like, for instance, in Arcane Sanctuary, let's say you're running along, and you got this long, straight path. Well, if you cast it this way, that's just not very intelligent. But the big brain move is to cast it like this. Now it goes down the entire pathway, all the way down this pathway, too. And if you do this stuff with Firewall so that you're actually casting it in the correct directions, you can often get like some pretty absolutely insane damage output from it. Like here, you would probably want to cast it like this so that it travels along that pathway, because the monsters might be standing on that particular pathway. And in this way, if you get used to the way that Firewall actually casts, you can cast it in specific areas, getting the highest damage output from the ability, which is pretty darn cool. It hits a lot of targets, obviously, when it's maxed out. So with that ridiculously high yard radius that it has of 63.3 yards, when you're casting it in places like the cow level, like Canyon of the Magi, areas that are really big, you can get some really good damage output from the fact that it literally travels off the screen in both directions, which is pretty cool. On top of this, it tends to work really good for anything that stands still, so bosses, big monsters that, aren't really going to, like, come fight you. When you're in situations where you have, like, archers that don't move very much, or mages that are just standing there in the background, it's very easy to just cast a firewall on them and just forget about their existence. So, like, for instance, in this particular case, like, say I was going into Chaos Sanctuary, and you're running along and you're fighting the knights. Well, a lot of the times the mages won't move, so you just put a firewall underneath them and you just laugh as they burn to death. They're not going to move out of the firewall anyway, so who cares? And you can just pinpoint target specific monsters with the ability, because more often than not, just one firewall underneath of a monster like that that's not going to move is going to kill them. Same thing here, when you're fighting these monsters that are chasing you. Putting it in the right pattern can definitely cause better damage output if you cast it correctly. It takes a little bit of practice, but once you get used to it, you can spread that firewall underneath the entire group as they chase you. All of this comes into handy, like, as you're building the Firewall Sorceress, because it just takes a little bit of skill and a little bit of practice before you, kind of get everything down. Now, as you're leveling Firewall, there is an optimal way to level it, and it involves your skill point distribution. So if we talk about that really quickly, basically what you do is you want to make sure you obviously get Warmth early on, because Warmth is a level 1 skill. And as you're leveling up, you're eventually going to lead yourself to Firewall. You want to max out Firewall first, and then after you max out Firewall, or you get to level 30, you want to make sure you 1-point Wonder Fire Mastery. And then after you 1-point Wonder Fire Mastery, you're going to want to level up Warmth, and then Fire Mastery. And to demonstrate what I mean by this, it's a damage output difference. So, for instance, let's reset this again. If I 1-point Firewall right here, and I max out Fire Mastery, you notice my damage output is 4,751, which isn't very high. However, if I max out Firewall itself, my damage output is 3,110, which isn't super amazing either. So what you're looking to do is you want to make sure you optimally spend your points to level this up so that you get your best output. The best output is going to be like this. 1-point Warmth, you're going to max out Firewall, you're going to 1-point Wonder Fire Mastery, which is going to give you a really nice 8,277. And if you stack out Fire Mastery at this particular point, you'll actually get less damage output than if you max out Warmth. And I can show you that as well. So max Fire Mastery is going to give me 12,578, whereas max Warmth is going to give me 14,269. So as you can see, there's actually a very specific way to level up the abilities to get the highest damage output from them as you're leveling your character. You definitely always want a 1-point Wonder Fire Mastery, and the more skill plus skills and things you can get, Fire Mastery will definitely help out better. But increasing the base damage of the skill actually has a stronger effect than leveling up Fire Mastery early on. Now, of course, you always want to level up Fire Mastery to max eventually, and that's going to get you to your higher damage output at that point. And the more plus the skills you have, of course, the better this goes, because, well, it just, Fire Mastery, Firewall, both are going to benefit from your plus to skills. I think that's pretty much it when it comes to Firewall. It's definitely one of the higher damage output abilities in this tree, but like a lot of the abilities in this tree, it does require that the monsters stand still. It's actually very odd for this tree, is that Firewall really does its best damage when the monsters stand still. Meteor really does its damage best when the monsters stand still. Hydra's really does its best damage when the monsters stand still. It's kind of silly. Same thing with Blaze and same thing with Inferno. You really kind of want the monsters to stand still in one place and actually get hit by the effect, and if you can do that, then the damage output is going to be really nice. But it's just kind of strange that like everything on the fire tree kind of requires the monsters to, you know, like just stand there and burn. You're just like, hey, you, just don't move. Just stand there and burn. Just burn. Good. All right, now sizzle and pop. Alright guys and gals, as always, I do appreciate you guys and gals watching my videos when I'm recording like this, and as always, keep watching.